Mhm. So let's move on to section 2. So these are the third thing in notes for chapter 8. So the last time we were doing notes, I guess was it Friday, we were in Chickadee, China, and I was talking about the Song Dynasty. And at one point, the Song Dynasty divides into a kind of a northern and southern Song Dynasty. One of the factors that led to that breakup, like previous kind of Chinese dynasties, the Chinese had always at the kind of the fringes there, these kind of nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures that were always kind of like pushing and pushing, dating back to probably the Zhou dynasty, and then with the Qin building the Great Wall of China and that. We had talked about groups like the Kitians who established their own dynasty called the Lao dynasty. We talked about groups like the Tanguts, Tibetans, and such. But the reason we don't kind of delve into them is that one group that is the superstars of the nomadic or semi-nomadic kind of world there in East Asia are the Mongols. All right, and so in the kind of 13th into the 14th and 15th century, the Mongols kind of established a massive empire. Now, this is the modern day country of Mongolia there in green. If you're not aware, there's a modern day country. It straddles right between Russia and China. During the Cold War, it was a communist country, which I think technically it still is. Geographically, this is kind of one of the lowest population densities in the world. I think like maybe nine people per square mile. But at one point in the 13th and the 14th, 15th century, this was a massive empire. So for the test, I need you to know that the Mongol or the Mongolian Empire is considered the largest unified land empire in world history. Stretching continuously at one point from Korea through China, kind of down into kind of Persia, to the borders of Europe, Russia, into that area. It is kind of like signified as the largest unified or continuous land empire because the largest empire in world history is the British Empire in the 18th, 19th into the 20th century. But the British Empire established their dominance through a kind of a navy. So how do the Mongolians go from being one of these kind of like semi-nomadic kind of like cultures on the steppe regions just outside of China to kind of establishing the largest empire in world history? I'm going to play this kind of short TED-Ed video that's going to kind of mention that and cover some stuff from that. So let me mute my mic.
It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Ukraine and from Siberia to southern China, and was forged on the open plains. In the 12th century CE, before the Mongol Empire formed, the East Asian steppe was home to scattered groups of Mongol and Turkic pastoral nomads led by Khans. The people herded sheep, cattle, yaks, and camels. They lived in felt tents and moved between summer and winter campsites. Nomadic women held significant authority, managing these migrations, many of the flocks, and trade. Meanwhile, men specialized in mounted warfare. These nomadic groups often fought each other. That was to change under Temujin, who was born into an aristocratic Mongol family. Despite losing his father at an early age and growing up in poverty, he quickly rose to power by forging strategic alliances with other leaders. Unlike those Khans, Temujin promoted soldiers based on merit and distributed spoils evenly among them. His most brilliant move was to scatter the nomads he conquered among his own soldiers so they couldn't join together against him. These innovations made him unstoppable. And by 1206, he had united the people of the felt wall tents and become Chinggis Khan. The Mongols were shamanists, believing that the spirits of nature and their ancestors inhabited the world around them. Over all arched the sky god Tengiri. Chinggis Khan believed that Tengiri wanted him to conquer the entire world in his name. With the nomads of the Mongolian plain united, this seemed within reach. Anyone who resisted the Mongols was resisting Tenggeri's will, and for this insubordination had to die. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols first subdued northern China and the eastern Islamic lands. After his death in 1227, the divine mandate passed to his family, or the Golden Lineage. In the 1230s, Genghis Khan's sons and daughters conquered the Turks of Central Asia and the Russian princes, then destroyed 2 European armies in 1241. In the 1250s, the Mongols seized Islamic territory as far as Baghdad, while in the east, their grasp reached southern China by 1279. Life within the Mongol Empire wasn't just war, pillage, and destruction. Once the Mongols conquered a territory, they left its internal politics alone and used local administrators to govern for them. The Mongols let all religions flourish, as long as the leaders prayed for them. Although they routinely captured artisans, scholars, and engineers, they appreciated what those specialists could do and forcibly settled them across Asia to continue their work. The most valuable produce in the empire was gold brocade, which took silk from China, gold from Tibet, and weavers from Baghdad. Gold brocade clothed the Mongol rulers, covered their horses, and lined their tents. The Mongols particularly prized gunpowder technicians from China. With much of Eurasia politically unified, trade flourished along the Silk Road, helped by an extensive system of horse messengers and relay posts. Robust trade continued at sea, especially in blue and white porcelain, which combined white pottery from Mongol China with blue dye from Mongol Iran. But this was not to last. Succession to the Great Khan didn't automatically go to the eldest son, but rather allowed brothers, uncles, and cousins to vie for leadership, with senior widows acting as regents for their sons. By the 1260s, Genghis Khan's grandsons were in a full-blown civil war over inheritance and fragmented the realm into 4 separate empires. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty is remembered as a golden age of science and culture. In Iran, the Ilkhanate inaugurated the development of new monumental architecture and Persian miniature painting. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate brought forth leaders like Timur and his descendant Babur, who founded the Mughal Empire in India. And in Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde ruled for years, until a trading post named Muscovy grew into a major world power. Even though the empire lasted only a short while, the Mongols left a legacy of world domination that remains unmatched today. Trace the rise and fall of other powerful empires with this playlist.
So to kind of understand the Mongols, you got to kind of like understand where they came from. And they mentioned in the video this kind of region called steppe. Steppe is just kind of a geographical region, means dry grassland. It's kind of similar to, like, if you've ever been to the Badlands in South Dakota, Nebraska area there. So the Mongols were part of this kind of long line of kind of nomadic tribes or semi-nomadic tribes that would move around based on seasons for their livestock, for grazing and such. So there wasn't necessarily anything particularly kind of like unique about them in a sense. They were excellent at horsemanship. They knew exactly when to fire their arrows right the moment that the horse's hooves were off the ground. But this does create a bit of a kind of a rugged culture. Right. This is kind of the steppe region in Mongolia. This is a kind of recreation of the first kind of Mongolian capital city called Karakorum, which was a tent city. So in the background, you can see those little white dots, and those are yurts. Those are the kind of the style of kind of tents that Mongols and other cultures in that region would use. Karakorum is actually technically in what is now modern day China. In northern China, they have a region where they refer to as Inner Mongolia, and then Outer Mongolia is essentially Mongolia proper. But the thing that kind of makes them kind of unique is that they're going to be able to kind of unify in the early 13th century and also take over other kind of semi-nomadic cultures as well. The Mongolian kind of Turkic term for a chieftain or ruler was Khan. In 1206, a Khan by the name of Temujin is going to unify the Mongols, the various tribes. He is given the title Genghis or Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler, universal leader. This was after a civil war, which with his blood brother, a guy named Jamuka. And there's a kind of a story, like kind of an elaborate kind of story about the birth of Temujin, whose name means blacksmith, actually. But he was born clutching a blood clot, which was significant in Mongol culture. That meant he'd be a great leader. His father was a Khan who was murdered by a rival tribe. So he kind of worked his way up. And so it was from there that kind of Temujin is kind of take over other cultures, eventually establishing the largest empire in kind of world history here. So there's an image in the west of Genghis, or Gengis, as you saw, listen to the video. It's a proper way to kind of pronounce it. This is him as more of a kind of a portly grandfather figure. This is established by one of his grandsons. But keep in mind, this is an individual who's probably responsible for the death of 1 million people. Also, he has a number of children. It's believed that 1 out of every 200 people worldwide can trace their heritage or their kind of bloodline back to Genghis Khan. In Mongolia, it's like 1 out of 6. There's numerous places that claim to have the mausoleum of Genghis Khan, but they've never recovered his body. The legend was that everybody who was kind of there at his burial was killed, so they wouldn't give up the exact location. In 2008, just outside of the modern-day capital Ulaanbaatar, they established a equestrian statue at a museum there. It's like a 130-foot statue of Genghis Khan looking east, where his birthplace was. This is, they believe, the very site that he recovered what's a golden whip. That's, again, kind of based on his mythology. Very similar to what Attila the Hun apparently found the sword of Mars prior to one battle. Now, what makes Genghis Khan a kind of a conqueror in the same kind of breath that we talk about Alexander the Great? One factor was he was superior authority, obviously in his name, but this also comes from a legal code that the written one has been lost to history. It's believed that it's based on kind of oral customs and traditions called the Great Yasa. And so this basically kind of states him as the preeminent kind of Khan. But it was very detailed in things like personal property, family law, stuff like that. It was somewhat liberal when it came to religious practices. It allowed for the religions that were conquered to maintain their traditions. Excuse me. However, there was some stipulations on like kind of halal, like the kind of Muslim kind of traditions of slaughtering sheep and stuff like that. But this was, I guess, kind of liberal for the time. Some things were heavy-handed, though. There was death penalties for things like adultery, things for like washing your clothes during a rainstorm. Also, urinating into a river could be punishable with death. So there were certain things that were somewhat heavy-handed, but a lot of historians tend to look on the liberal concepts when it comes to allowing for these cultures to practice a lot of these religions. And later, descendants of Genghis Khan are going to convert to things like Buddhism and Islam and stuff like that. And then I already typed these out for you guys, but he was a great organizer when it came to military structure. He kind of created a military based on a meritocracy. The idea, like kind of like your performance, kind of like you could be elevated to certain positions. There was an elite military corps called the Kashik, which he kind of established. A lot of this is based on tens and hundreds. Also, he was a shrewd military leader. A lot of times in these military campaigns, the entire kind of tribe would basically kind of pick up their homes, and they would go, and kind of like women would serve as kind of like, nurses and food and stuff like that. But he also was very cruel. You can't deny that. Like I said, it's hard to get an exact number how many people were killed, but over 1 million. There was stated in the Great Yasa, anybody who was taller than the wheel of a cart was open to slaughter. And so that was pretty evident in his conquest of kind of Persia, Afghanistan, and Iran, and those areas there. So you can't really deny that. But again, this is something that will be like one of those all the following tech questions you may see on the test. Also, too, by kind of controlling a lot of areas along the Silk Road, there was a kind of an era that historians refer to as the Pax Mongolia. All right, where we see kind of one kind of power controlling the major trade routes along the Silk Road. And with that, there was also a kind of a pony express kind of established called the Yam, which is a series of postal relay stations every 25 miles or so stretched along the kind of Silk Road, where goods as well as like decrees and stuff like that could be kind of passed on. Riders, depending on like weather and stuff like that, could probably ride 125 miles a day, which was pretty impressive. This is, like I said, 600 years before the kind of the Pony Express. And also, too, Genghis would place kind of local ambassadors in charge of kind of regional governments and that, allowing them to maintain certain customs. So they refer to this as the Pax Mongolia era there. And so essentially, like I said, geographically speaking, this is the area that the kind of the Mongol Empire basically stretched from Korea all the way through Asia to the borders of Europe, Poland and Hungary in there. This is what they call it. Basically, it's like a passport that certain ambassadors would carry with them along the Silk Road to give them kind of free access to travel. It was also the Mongolian language was codified, was kind of established as a written language during the time of Genghis Khan. There's a lot of influence on Chinese there, but the language is actually written from top to bottom and read kind of like right to left. However, in 1227, he dies. Before conquering China. He gives his third son, Ogadai, the title of Great Khan to succeed him. He had two older sons, kind of fought amongst each other. So Ogadai was kind of viewed as the kind of unifier, if you will. Eventually, Ogadai is going to extend kind of Mongol control into Russia, in an area they refer to as the Golden Horde. We'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about Russian history next chapter. The Golden Horde was essentially where you would have cities like Moscow and Kiev that would pay a tax to the Mongols. So they would be able to keep their princes and such, and their kind of like their lineage of monarchies in power, but they would have to pay tribute to the Mongols. Later, the Mongols outsourced this to the Tartars, and that's going to be kind of the political structure in Russia up until the time of Ivan III, Ivan the Great in Moscow. And so after Ogadai's death, that's when we start to see the kind of empire divide into separate khanates. We talked about Hulagu, who kind of sacked Baghdad in 1259. He was the one who kind of is the precursor to what they call the Ilkhanate. There's my man Ogadai, nice mustache, goatee combo there. All right, one of his grandsons, Kublai Khan, kind of completes the task that he was unable to do, and that's defeating the Song dynasty, taking the mandate of heaven and establishing what they call the Huan dynasty. This is the period of Mongol rule over China. This is the first time there was a kind of foreigners controlling the mandate of heaven. Like I said, his grandson Kublai Khan establishes this some 20 years after Hulagu sacked Baghdad. They were essentially cousins. Like I said, Genghis Khan has an extensive kind of family tree here. So this is kind of like China as geographical zenith because it encompasses both Mongolia and China. And so Kublai Khan is kind of governing more like a kind of a Chinese emperor than he would as a Mongol Khan. But technically there's two capitals. There's Karakorum and then another city here we'll talk about. So this is our Western image of Kublai Khan. This is probably the more accurate image here. This is a painting commissioned at the same time that painting of Genghis Khan I showed you as a kind of portly grandfather figure. Kublai Khan actually is the founder, but he posthumously gives Genghis Khan credit as being the founder of the Huan dynasty. The capital of the Huan dynasty, the Mongol rule in China, is the city of Khan Balik, the city of the Great Khan, which is essentially Beijing. Beijing was actually sieged by his grandfather, by Genghis Khan, for about 3 months and completely annihilates the population of the city. So we still have city centers, though, like places like Xiangyang and Hangzhou and that are kind of like in the millions. So this is a very sizable empire. But this, in many cases, people would refer to Kublai as the Great Khan. He had kind of other cousins that were ruling in other areas, like the video had talked about. And so Genghis probably wouldn't recognize his grandson's rule as being Mongol. It'd be more Chinese, if you will. And so this is essentially the geography of the Yuan dynasty, encompassing what is Mongolia, dipping down into parts into Southeast Asia, like Burma, Myanmar. And so like I said, he rules more like kind of a Chinese emperor. He lives in an opulent palace. There's a summer palace called Xanadu that was kind of famously documented. He has Chinese kind of Confucian scholars advise him and kind of writing the histories and trying to maintain some aspects of Chinese culture. And the cities were kind of laid out in Chinese grid fashion, where like this is Kambalik. The emperor and the kind of the throne represented the North Star. However, he does deviate from certain kind of Chinese customs, particularly the civil service examinations based on the teachings of Confucius. More and more, you found people kind of serving in the bureaucracy that were their loyalty was to the Khan. But there's, again, the Chinese are kind of the majority population being kind of governed by a minority population, that there's a bit of kind of like some uneasiness between the Mongol rulers and the Chinese population. So Kublai Khan established something called the Yushate, which is a kind of like a spy agency to make sure the Chinese bureaucracy was governing in the Khan's best interests, basically to keep them honest, so to speak. And so we start to see less and less of not necessarily what you know, but who you know, to get kind of like civil service gigs. But the overwhelming population are Chinese, so you're going to have them serve in some capacity, if you will. So the Yushate creates a little bit of tension between the two populations. Another factor that kind of creates a little bit of tension here is the emergence of a kind of a new class called the Semyuren, which were basically kind of foreigners from places like Persia, West Asia, India, and South Asia, and even Europe, that lived in China during the Yuan era. At one point, they are actually going to be like on a higher social status than the indigenous Chinese are. Many of them are given kind of, they're initially kind of a merchant class. Many of them are given kind of like civil service jobs and jobs within the government. So this creates, again, some more tension between the Chinese and the Mongols that eventually going to lead to the Ming dynasty kind of emerging here. Probably the most famous Semyuren is somebody that if you ever gone to a swimming pool, you probably shouted out his name, and that's Marco Polo. Marco Polo was from Venice in Italy, who apparently with his father and uncle traveled to China twice. It was during his second stint in China that he talks about serving in the court of Kublai Khan. All this was kind of laid out in a book that he had dictated while he was in jail in Italy called Il Milione. In there, he talks about Xanadu, the summer palace, and serving Kublai Khan. But there's some things that he leaves out, like there's no mention of the Great Wall. And so that seems a little odd, if you will. But this does kind of create a bit of wanderlust when this is printed. It's believed that Christopher Columbus had a copy of Il Milione on him when he made his journey to the New World. All right, so it's a little bit influential when we talk about kind of the age of exploration. There was like some myths that like spaghetti was brought back to Italy, although there's evidence of pasta there, like during the time of the Etruscans, Venetian blinds, stuff like that. This here is an image of Marco Polo as an older man. This is an illustration within Il Milione, which shows him giving tribute to Kublai Khan. If you notice, Kublai Khan looks more like kind of a European king than a kind of Chinese emperor or Mongolian Khan. He was probably, because the person illustrating this had never been to China. So when he's hearing these stories and trying to kind of like illustrate them, you basically kind of draw images that you're at least familiar with. All right. Now, the decline of the Yuan dynasty, again, this is debatable, but 1281 is when Korea was brought into kind of the Yuan rule. And Korea was kind of this place that Chinese emperors dating back to the Sui were always trying to kind of integrate into. Mainly, the Yuan were using Korea as a jump-off point to invade Japan. So they sent like 2 fleets. The first, with about 150,000 warriors. This is an amphibious invasion, a seaborne invasion there. This was the largest seaborne invasion up until the Normandy invasion of World War II. So the first kind of fleet makes its way there. The second fleet, though, is caught up in a major typhoon that in Japanese history they refer to as the kamikaze, the divine wind. And so this basically kind of like knocked out the kind of the Mongol ships that were there for reinforcements, and then the Mongols that were there were basically kind of stranded there. This is important to Japanese history because this allows Japan to kind of maintain its independence, and it's the beginning of them for the Yuan dynasty. All right. And so you guys, if you guys took U.S. history last year, you guys probably talked about World War II kamikaze pilots. This was a name given to them to signify that they were saving Japan. Again, history, for good or bad, can be kind of an inspiration. All right. So tomorrow, either we'll be at home or at school. I'll talk about Japanese and Korean history tomorrow. All right. So let me stop recording. All right. You guys stay warm out there.